Hey, I'm Dr. Gibbons. If you don't know me already, I'm going to be talking to you all about viruses. Viruses are something we think that you guys should learn about this semester, considering we're in the middle of a terrible pandemic caused by a virus. There are notes that are following along an outline that you can use to go along with the lecture, and my advice is for you to download that outline and fill it in as we're going through this. Okay, so this is chapter 19 in your book, and this is an outline of what we're going to discuss. And this is going to be broken up into several different short recordings. One thing that I'm not going to cover, but that sometimes standardized tests like to talk about, are retroviruses. Retroviruses are in your book, but it's not going to be covered in these lectures, so it might be something you want to just read about anyways. Okay, so we're going to start out with, are viruses alive? Well, it's actually not a very simple question, are viruses alive? They have a lot of characteristics that are lifelike and a lot of characteristics that are not lifelike. So most likely on the first day of class, you guys went over a bunch of characteristics of life from your textbook. And your list may have been slightly different from this, but it's probably pretty close. Some characteristics of life are order, which means that the thing that is living has a particular structure. All of the individuals of a particular species have similar structure, so their body parts are put together, or the cell is put together in a specific way. All living things have chemical instructions that are based on genetic material, which can be either DNA or RNA. All living things have metabolic activities, for example, cellular respiration, where they burn sugars to do work. Also, photosynthesis is another metabolic activity, so all living things have cellular respiration and or photosynthesis. All living things have energy flow and matter recycling, which basically means that they acquire energy, use energy, and excrete waste products. All living things also have homeostasis, which means that they can support some sort of balance inside and outside of their cells. And that balance can be solute balance, salt balance, water balance, or temperature, or sugar balance, number of other things. So homeostasis is a characteristic of living things. Living things have to have the ability to reproduce, so to create more of them. And also, living things are prone to evolutionary adaptation, which means basically acquiring changes in their genetic material over time through populations. So, what are some of the characteristics of viruses? This lists some lifelike characteristics of viruses. Viruses are subject to evolution. They can reproduce, although this is a little bit complicated, but they can create more of themselves. They carry DNA or RNA, so they have genetic material. And because they have genetic material, that means they have genes. They also have proteins, which was not listed. Having genes and having proteins were not listed as characteristics of life in the previous slide, but they're sort of inherent in some of the other characteristics that were listed there. And they also bind to receptors on cells, which kind of seems like they have a behavior, which you would think might be a characteristic of living things. Some folks basically characterize reproduction as the main thing that determines if something is alive. So reproduction with gene-controlled heredity is the most basic attribute of life, is the stance for scientists and also in some textbooks. So based on just reproduction, one might argue that viruses are alive. But viruses also have a lot of non-lifelike characteristics. For example, they can't do any metabolism, so there's no photosynthesis, no cellular respiration. They cannot maintain homeostasis inside and outside of the virus themselves. They have no ability to maintain any homeostasis. They don't respond to stimuli. They cannot take in energy, so there's none of that matter recycling that we talked about before, and as a result, they don't have any excretion. So if we were to go back to that original list of characteristics of life, some of the things viruses can do and some of the things viruses can't do. So yes, they have a particular order or structure, and I guess I should tell you that I showed you pictures of different viruses that look really different from one another, but each virus has its own particular structure. So that is a characteristic of living things. They do have chemical instructions, which can be either DNA or RNA. They do have the ability to reproduce, and they do have the ability to undergo evolutionary adaptation. However, they are unable to do metabolic activities. They do not have energy flow or matter recycling, and they cannot do homeostasis. So as you can see, they have a combination of living and non-living characteristics. Because of that, viruses are considered, in your textbook in particular, leading a borrowed life. So they exist in the shady area between living and non-living things. They are, in general, not considered living. They are non-living things. What they are infectious particles that consist of genes packaged in a protein coat. They are much simpler in structure than even the most primitive living prokaryotic cells. So they are non-living. They are more simple than even the most simple living things. They cannot reproduce or carry out metabolism outside of a host cell. So while they can reproduce, they must have a host cell in order to do it. So because of that, they are considered non-living. Here is an image, or actually it's a picture from your textbook, of viruses. Viruses appearing to do things that one would attribute to a living thing. Viruses appear to bud from these animal cells, but so these animal cells are these large structures here, and this is a virus basically budding off of an animal cell. But essentially what's happening is these viruses are using the animal cells to reproduce, and then they are leaving the animal cell. So this is what a drawing of that looks like. And this is an actual photograph of a human immune cell infected with HIV. So doing basically the same thing that last image was showing, but you can see all of these little tiny specks are in fact the viruses leaving this animal cell. So you can see that this has thousands of viruses coming off of the cell, and the viruses are using that cell for reproduction, and then the animal cell is releasing the viruses to infect other cells. So that's the last slide from this first recording, and the next recording will deal with virus structure.